Well, thank you, Kim, for inviting me to do this presentation. Thank you to everybody who's attending. Special thanks to Mark Smith, who has helped me in a lot of ways, including sharing his research on Reverend Smith. Um, I'm going to be doing this in a fairly formal way because I've never done Zoom before, and I'm going to try and fit everything in. There's a lot to cover, but I'm going to do as much as I can. Uh, but you really should go and read the article because there's so much material, especially the stories and the historical documents that I really that's what's interesting about this. All right, let me begin. Folklorist Louise Walker was visiting old Jawinacom near Charlevoix around 1950. Nyanyashi, his grandson, said, "I'd like to sleep all winter like a bear, then wake up come spring and eat lots. Better go out on Sand Hill and sleep forever like Makwa Shingashin." Nyanyashi laughed. "It's too cold." And then to Walker, "You get the old man to tell that story. That's old time story." Old Joanna. "That's stories for a papoose." Of course, Walker managed to get him to tell the story, and then she tried to reproduce his legend of the sleeping bear as nearly like the original, how he told it, as she could. Don't expect grammatical written English from oral storytellers, especially if it's not their first language. And it's important to understand that Anishinaabe Moan, Anishinaabe language, does not have articles, and it does not used to be when not really needed. And this affects how non-English native speakers speak English. Old Jawinacom began the story. Old she-bear, she got two cubs, very hungry. Cubs, they cry all the time, ask mother for food. She ain't got food. She feel very bad, and she's hungry too. Plenty of food in Michigan. And story ends. Makwa haul herself up on Big Sand Hill and look out over Lake Michigan. She cry to Gitche Manitou and ask why he take her cubs. Just want to die. She lay on Sand Hill and look at lake. Then she see two islands begin to come out of the water. Who edited the issue of Midwest Folklore, which Walker's article with the story appeared, commented, I'm sure through clenched teeth, curiously, this is one of the best known tourist legends in Michigan. Dorson had done field work in the UP in 1946 before the bridge. Wonderful book, still the best book of Michigan folklore, called Blood Stoppers and Bear Walkers. While there, he was told about some origin stories. They're just some Indian legends we had to make up for the tourists. One of my photos, just to show off. Not very good. Dorson coined the term fakelore, but this has really been a concern that goes back to the ancient Greeks, where scholars were opposed to reinterpretations of Homer for various political and other purposes. Fakelore is misrepresentations of stories, songs, etc., as belonging to folk communities. Sometimes these are loose adaptations that are passed off as if this is how they were actually told in a community. Sometimes they're total inventions, but over time, it ends up people thinking that they must be for real, and you have to trace it to figure out that they weren't. This is a huge problem with legends and picture books and textbooks that are taught as multiculturalism, even though they're nothing close to that. There's also a very important intellectual history that I go into some extent in my article on fakelore and ethics in children literature that is important to understand, because part of the 19th century, early 20th century racist argument that primitive people were intellectually childlike was all these childlike stories that were not actually by native peoples. There's a romanticism formula from around 1800, probably borrowed from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Extreme love, faith, self-sacrifice, or devotion leads to the creation of some beautiful place or thing. A classic example is Icarus and Daedalus, an escape over the water, the boy urged on by his father, sinking beneath the wine dark sea, the father looking back, a point or an island emerges to commemorate the drowned beloved. Sound familiar? Very popular are Lover's Leaps. There was probably an actual suicide at Lake Pippin on the Mississippi by a Dakota maiden to avoid a forced marriage around 1750. But after that, the Lover's Leaps proliferated. Great quote from a 1882 tourism guidebook. Mackinac Island, not to be behind in anything that is fashionable and proper, has two of these interesting rocks and reminiscences. This is from a 1882 guidebook. I said that. But you can see from this why Dorson was skeptical. All right, let's talk about the early versions that we know of the legend of Sleeping Bear. The first one I came across was published in the Detroit Free Press, January 23rd, 1891, told by Windigoish, means stinking giant, actually. He was an Odawa, probably from Little Traverse. In this version, the bears are fleeing a forest fire. The Peshtigo fire was in October 1871. This version ends. The spirits of the cubs are supposed to abide on the islands, and that of the mother bear keeps a constant and loving watch over the homes of her loved ones. On stormy nights, the Indians say the spirit of the mother bear moans and cries from her post on the great sand bluff in anxiety for the fate of her young, the shores of whose homes are being assailed by the treacherous waves which caused their death. In 1915, a local Harbor Springs writer, John C. Wright, published Stories of the Crooked Tree, a fairly short pamphlet. Wright was the grandson of Sophia Bailey Graveret and Henry Graveret Jr. His uncle Garrett commanded Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. Mark Smith just had an interesting article about Company K in the Northern Express a few weeks ago. In his book, Wright first told the Great Makwa origin story for Sleeping Bear, which we'll discuss later. He followed this with a comment, frequently we find more than one legend regarding a certain place. He then began with a brief version. Wisconsin shore of Lake Michigan suffered a famine, and ended. The mother reached the beach and crept to a resting place where she lay down facing the restless waters that covered her lost ones. As she gazed, 2 beautiful islands slowly rose to mark the graves. These were called the Manitous, the home of departed spirits. The next year, Wright published a much longer version with many more stories titled The Crooked Tree. In it, the mother and cubs legend was elevated and newly framed by a story about his grandmother from whom he heard it. The Great Makwa was relegated to late in the book, preceded by the remark about more than one legend. At some point after this, by the 1920s, the mother and cubs legend became known to the general public. Exactly how this happened, I don't think it's possible to trace. But it certainly by that point, and moving into the 1930s, had become a well-known story outside the Native community. All right, how do we track provenance of old stories, of Native stories, any type of folklore? In this case, we have to ask, how well does it fit with traditional landscape origin stories? Were there historical accounts where we might have expected the person writing the account to have heard it and therefore want to tell it? We also need to look at other Manitou and animal named islands. So let's talk about Anishinaabe landscape origin Adazukan. That means sacred stories. All these are sacred stories, and we really should treat them as sacred stories. Often these stories have violence or humor. Almost all of them feature Baju, also known as Baju or Baju, the Ojibwe Odawa trickster transformer, similar to Coyote out west, if you're familiar with Coyote. One quote about him is from the geologist surveyors Foster and Whitney in 1850, from whom that report, that previous slide came. Our voyageurs had many legends to relate of the pranks of the Manitous in these caverns of the pictured rocks, and in answer to our inquiries seemed disposed to fabricate stories without end of the achievements of this Indian deity. I'll quickly go back so you can see that drawing. There are lots of wonderful drawings from that report. Back in 1669, Father Alloway recounted the origin of the Sioux in his Jesuit relation of that year. Machabos, the great hare, a precursor probably to Baju, trampled the dam of the giant beavers, leaving rapids. This story is told of many other places, which is one indication of its antiquity. There's a long version with multiple origins that was told by Chief Panesi of Fort William, 1904, which you can find along with lots of comparative stuff on my website, The Origin of Likenesses of Baju. One of the origins was of Otterhead on Lake Superior, its north shore. Baju had left the otter on a roasting spit. There's another place, unidentified, where he fell on his butt. As many times as he sees where he had slid, he laughed. That's important in understanding the character of Baju, that he was able to laugh at himself. A very important site known as Baju or Devil's Chair off Point Gargantua in Lake Superior Provincial Park. This was noted by Alexander Henry as a place for offerings in 1766, and it showed up as Baju on Belin's 1744 map. Towards the end of the story, Baju kills his grandmother, Nokomis, Grandmother Earth, for not watching for great beavers. 1855 version, told to Cole, pictured rocks were colored from the slap. It is hardly possible to discover a more unromantic and barbarous origin for a natural scene so beautiful and romantic. And there's the blood on pictured rocks. A few more landscape origins. There are many more in the paper. Hare who sits, rabbit's back near St. Ignace, visible from Mackinac Island, where Nana Baju recovered after being burnt in the form of a bunny during the theft of fire. That's how people got fire. Flinty Point on Lake Michigan in Antrim, where Nana Baju slew his brother, he who hews upon his shin. Manitou Payment or Manitou Bimwa near Nobbingway, probably from the flood story of the shooting of the Great Lynx, Mitsubishi, which then leads to the flood. Kettle Point, north of Sarnia, where Nana Baju left his cumbersome kettle behind. None of the landscape origin stories with strong Anishinaabe provenance have the love rewarded by beauty origin formula. It's almost impossible to find a traditional story anywhere in the country, one that we can clearly say was an old story in any collections anywhere in the country that had used that formula. This is Belen's excerpt from Belen's map. On it is Lorskidor over here and Manabaju up there. All right, let's talk about historical accounts of Sleeping Bear. There are several accounts that might have told of the mother cub legend if it existed at the time. Legend of Sleeping Bear is not a story that would have been kept secret or subject to censorship. This also provided me an excuse to bring together all these wonderful accounts, or some of these wonderful accounts, which in itself are worth reading. Lorskidor first showed up on an earlier map, Francolin, in 1688. Probably Henri de Tonty was his informant. Tonty traveled in the fall of 1679 along the Michigan shore to meet with LaSalle, who went south on the Wisconsin side. This was when LaSalle lost the Griffin, one of our famous shipwrecks. Odontagon, also known as Jean Leblanc, told Cadillac in 1701 of the intent of some Mackinac Odawa to relocate at Lorskidor. Probably did not happen at the time, but that was another mention of it. The chief administrator, the intendant of New France, Rodot, wrote in 1710, one finds there a mountain which Les Sauvages call the bear who sleeps, Lorskidor, because it is of that shape. They say that after the deluge, the canoe that saved their fathers came aground there and stopped. Note that there's a sacred story being referred to in reference, the deluge, the flood story. As an aside, as you know, anytime we use historical sources, it's impossible to censor language that we now find offensive, and these are still very, very valuable. One little thing I've gotten in the habit of doing is to try to remember to write it as les sauvages instead of savage, because it's less pejorative. It actually means wild. It also sort of highlights, yes, there's a word here. Charlevoix camped on a small island, probably South Manitou, on August 1, 1721. I perceived on a promontory of sand a kind of grove that when you are traveling by has the appearance of the figure of an animal lying down. The French have named this the bear who sleeps, l'ours qui dort, and les sauvages, the bear lying down, l'ours couché. Translate l'ours couché into Anishinaabe Moin, and you come up with Makwa Shingashin. Remember the name used by old Jawinaka. Some other accounts. Gurdon Hubbard, one of the founders of Chicago, was then an apprentice trader for the American Fur Company, left an entertaining description of climbing the dune in 1822. I'm not going to spoil it by summarizing. It's a must read. Think number 9 at Pierce Stocking Drive. I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with that. The English author, Harriet Martineau, who happened to be a Jeopardy clue a couple of days ago, she wrote, "We were up before 5 on the morning of the 4th of July in 1836 to see the Manitoba Isles. They are the sacred isles of the Indians to whom they belong. Manitou is the name of everything sacred. It is said that they believe these islands to be the resort of the spirits of the departed. Then, passing Sleeping Bear, she was told of a shipwreck where some soldiers lost their lives and others made it to a nearby Indian lodge where they were warmed and kindly treated." Then in 1839, Henry Schoolcraft published his algic researches, which were stories, including several stories that were set on Lake Michigan. I'm sure Schoolcraft was familiar with the legend of the sleeping bear. He would have told it. In August 1836, the Reverend Doherty passed and wrote, "The sleeping bear has its name from the resemblance which a clump of bushes on the top of the barren sandbank at a distance has to a bear laying down." Reverend Smith, George Smith, July 1852. "I started with son George and daughter Arvila about 3 to go see him, the bear. We walked nearly 1.5 miles and ascended some 300 feet." Faustine, on September 6, 1868, wrote, "My situation as a school teacher at Onumanee village is romantic in the extreme. To the left, at the elevation of 500 feet, lies Sleeping Bear Point, so called from its resemblance to a bear with his head resting upon his forepaws. To the right of that, the Manitou Islands lift their emerald crests from Lake Michigan's broad bosom." Faustine, who Mark Smith discovered was actually Seti Powers, soon to be daughter-in-law of Reverend Smith, wrote love-death poetry. She would undoubtedly have loved the legend of Sleeping Bear had she heard of it. And there's Faustine. I still want somebody to write a historical novel about her. Martha Gray's reminiscence from 1868. "Sleeping Bear Point is a huge mountain of pure white sand that has been accumulating through the centuries. It is always moving, always growing. Sleeping Bear was caught and imprisoned within his class, and sorry, was caught and imprisoned within his class, the giant monarchs of the forest. Their tops peer at passers-by as though a mute appeal for liberation. But they will never be released, for old Sleeping Bear has lain under the spell of an enchanter for centuries and will never awaken until some throes of nature arouse him from his sleeping place beside the blue water. We also need to think about other Manitou islands. There are several of them, one off Keweenaw Point, one in the Apostles, one in Lake Nipissing. Manitoulin means the place of Manitou Den in the old L form Odawa. It's now N form. That'd be Manitouwalan. That's Manitouwanan. All these places, including the Manitou Den, are considered dangerous and off limits, as there's some evidence was also true of our Manitou Islands. There are several islands with animal names: beaver, amik, fox, wagoosh, wobbleshanks, as it was known to the sailors, little fox, wagoshants. There are bear islands in Les Chenaux and the Apostles. Little Bear is Macoons. So we have to ask, why wouldn't the Manitous be the Macoons if they were tied to Makwashingashin by story? There are several legends also relating to Sleeping Bear and the Manitous that connect to warfare in the area. That map in the previous slide was from 1641, which shows Odawa, Neutral, and Lower Manitou nations. Likely the warfare, the stories about the warfare stem from the time of attacks by Odawa and Neutral on Mascoutin, most significantly in the written records in 1641 and 1642. If you look on the Tracking Bear page on my website, I've tried to bring all this stuff together in a study of oral and written histories. I don't have time to begin to cover that now. Much research needs to be done, including archaeology north of Cross Village, where supposedly there were large Mascoutin settlements. Okay, time for the Great Makwa. Remember, this was Wright's initial origin story for Sleeping Bear. It tells of a marauding great bear devastating West Michigan. All the greatest warriors were easily destroyed. Finally, the bear was overcome by a gentle maiden who carried a potion from an old sorceress. He lies to this day on the east shore of Lake Michigan, where he may be seen from passing boats at a point called Sleeping Bear. Wright's story gave no reason for why the Great Makwa was marauding. I suspect it was part 2, missing part 1, of a story that's known as the Wampum Bear. There's a version from Schoolcraft. Mishi Makwa, destroying all in his path in pursuit of those who stole his wampum, is finally subdued by a young woman, again a young woman, who applies the magic of her brother's undying head. The bear, tottering, soon fell with a tremendous noise. Cut to pieces, they saw running off in every direction small black bears such as are seen, at the present day. In other words, this is a origin story of the black bear. If the bear had been left lying down instead of cut up, it could be the origin story, as with the Great Makwa, of sleeping bear. I'm going to go through an entire story of Chief Panessi's wampum bear. Hopefully won't take up all our time. I think I can get it in. He does not have the pursuit. It has a different, very interesting ending, but you can imagine somebody else telling the story and having a pursuit. I've added a bilingual text of this as well as a longer translation study with much more from Schoolcraft's story than I put in the Sleeping Bear paper. It's on my website. Once, as the story goes, people were living there. One man, also one woman, also two infants, their children. And once, in the evening, something they hear making a sound. And so they were afraid. And again, on the morrow in the evening, again, they hear it making a sound. And closer is the sound being made. And so truly they are afraid. And again, on the morrow in the evening, they hear it. And it is very close. And they are very afraid. Quietly, they stayed there. And on the morrow, so this they see, a person with a copper metal war club. Ah, bonjour, bonjour, my friend, he is told by the one who comes arriving. And so he sets it down from off his back. And so it makes a great sound. So in fact, that is what has been speaking to them. Very heavy it is. And so he entered there into the wigwam. And with corn they feed him. And after he has eaten, he speaks to whom he has visited. Would you not, my friend, accompany me? Over there, to the other side of the great lake I go. So over there is medicine for all kinds of harm, he says. Why, I will accompany you. And so on the morrow, they started off. And when at evening they camped, he threw down that great war club. A very loud noise it made. For a long time they went walking along. And on the 10th day, so it is, they came to the shore of that great, great lake, meaning ocean. And so they made a raft. They want to cross the great lake. Also the paddle they want to use, they made. And so they embarked. Also they had stowed the war club on board. And so they started off. They had no reason to sleep. Also all night with great force they paddled. This went on for many a night. And once, in the morning, so it is, they saw somebody sitting down. Great Makwa. So over there I am going, says that Odawa, the visitor. So that hung around his neck is a bag. Medicine for all kinds of things that harm are inside there. Many people who would attempt in vain to get that bag are killed by him. If the weather is greatly hot, so it is then that he sleeps. A wampum strap hangs around his neck. So from there is tied that bag. If he sleeps, So it is then I could approach and remove that wampum strap. So towards there let us float. Later, tomorrow, you and I shall go there. And so they smoke. Let there be a greatly clear sky tomorrow, says that Odawa. Truly, the next day the sky is greatly clear. And so they see that Great Makwa, much like a cloud that hung aloft, so that is how he appears. He is very huge. And so gradually closer toward him they went. He does not lie down to sleep. So he only lets droop his head. Very afraid is that one person. And then, as it is going on noon, so it is that they see him let droop his head. Ah, my friend, paddle with all your might. And so they landed. And that Odawa went and disembarked running. A ways into the woods, the other is sitting. And so he went approaching that Odawa. And so he reached for that wampum strap. He unstrung it, but around that hand of the other it is hooked. And that Odawa, cautiously, he lifted the other's hand. And so he came racing towards the shore with that bag. And so he stowed it on board. Ah, my friend, let us start off. Paddle with all your might. If he sees us, you and I will be killed. Only if his view is obscured will nothing be done to you and I. And then, being somewhat far off, so it is, the Odawa speaks. Alas, we are doomed, my friend. Already we have been seen by him. And so the other comes approaching the water. He thrusts his head into the water. And so they are pulled towards him by his gulping. And so back towards him they are drawn. And the Odawa, he unties and takes off the war club. And so he says to his companion, steer properly. And the Odawa, he stood at the front of the raft holding his war club. Straight toward where the bear is they fly. And when there at the bear's mouth they arrive flying, so it is that he strikes the other on the head. And so he knocked him out. And so flying back out again flows that water. And so again far off in a way they floated. And as they look at where the bear is, so it is that he was getting up. And off he went into the woods. Ah, my friend, paddle with all your might. So not again will you and I be taken notice of by him. And so they lived. And this is where Schoolcraft has a pursuit. And so they came homewards until they came to the shore. And also they came walking along. And when they arrived at from where purposely they had gone off together, so it is they examined that medicine for all kinds of harm. And half he gave to his companion, and half he has for himself. And so he says, so this will you have, and as for me, this will I have. You, not away, you will be told. And I, Odawa, I will be told. You and I will be very knowledgeable of the knowledge of medicine. And so they named how the various kinds of medicine will be used. And when they named how all the various kinds of medicine will be used, so it is they went their separate ways. So the story is of such a length. now for something completely different. I want to talk about a different context, which is the importance of Anishinaabe maternal mourning. I mean, of course, when children die, all mothers are unhappy, but it was a particularly important theme in Anishinaabe culture. There was deep maternal grief over the death of a child, especially infants. The afterworld, walkwing, could only be reached by crossing a shaky, slippery tree across a great river. Infants in cradle boards, Dikinagan, are unable to cross. Johann Cole was told in 1855, most of the souls spring across, balance themselves properly, and save themselves. Those, however, that jump short or slip off the bridge fall into the water and are converted into toads or fishes. Little children fare very badly here because they are not good jumpers. Hence, our mothers can never be consoled when their children die before the time when they could help themselves along the road to paradise. There are a couple of wonderful stories and a lot of analysis and accounts from way back on my website in a story study, The Place Where the Ghosts Dance Together, one of my favorites. Sophia Belli Gravere told a unique version where a mother, Nokokwe, my grandma woman, goes to the afterworld to bring back her son. Wright's grandmother lost both her son and husband in the July 1864 campaign before Richmond. Okay, so here's my thinking. I think most likely explanation for the legend of Sleeping Bear is bicultural origin. The mother and cub story fits the enduring love, creation of beauty narrative model, and it's very similar to Daedalus and Icarus. The mother love for dead infants is a strong Anishinaabe theme. There's no trace of the story before 1870, an inferred date based on the 1891 publication. But we know that by 1891, it was told and continued to be told within the Little Traverse Odawa community. Most likely the story was created with someone well-versed in classical mythology who had ties to that community. Sophia Belli Gravere fits the profile and told the story. We know that. Her claim to have heard the story as a child on her way from Mackinac from Grand River in 1812 can be easily disproved. Like many other family stories, we get those who watch Gates's wonderful PBS show, Finding Your Roots. It happens almost every episode. We've uncovered untrue stories for both my family and my wife's family. Sophia Belli Gravere not only lived at Little Traverse from late 1850s, she had maternal kin among the Odawa. She deserves a lot of further research for other reasons. Hopefully there's some stuff about her out there. She probably spoke Anishinaabe Moan. She was the goddaughter of Ma'am Laframboise, very well-known figure. Her stepmother was known as a great storyteller in the native language. Sophia herself was book educated. She was a former school teacher noted for her gift as a storyteller. So I think a common sense scenario, we can't prove it, but it makes sense to me, is she invented the legend of Sleeping Bear to tell her grandchildren after the death of her son and husband. Then she told it to her Odawa friends and relations, who liked it, whether they believed it of ancient origin or not. As a folklorist, I have no problem with the legend of the sleeping bear being conceived as a favorite story of generations of Little Traverse Odawa, or possibly even Grand Traverse, though we don't have any evidence of that. Even if the story was created in 1870 by a bicultural storyteller, especially as told orally by someone like Ojawinakam, Native communities have long borrowed tales from Europeans as well as from each other. Not all stories told by indigenous peoples originated in antiquity. Some did, which is very fascinating. But we shouldn't be trying to treat more recent ones as if they automatically must origin. However, as the best known tourist legend in Michigan, I think it's in effect fakelore. It's popular because it fits romantic stereotype of what Native stories are about. As a papoose, for a papoose, as old Shawinigan put it, even if it really were very old, it's as if Goodnight Moon was treated as the epitome of Western literature. It's atypical of Anishinaabe landscape origin Atazukan, and it's been promoted to the exclusion of Great Makwa, Wampum Bear, and other stories. Authentic narrative oral tradition of Anishinaabe and other Native Americans is replete with humor, irony, conflict, trickery, treachery, sorcery, and poignancy. Reflective on social, cultural, natural, and existential dilemmas, and endowed with intellectual, aesthetic, and moral complexity. This is something that's very important to understand. Traditional stories are serious literature, serious scripture, and they need to be treated like that. Okay, well, I'm only a few minutes longer than I thought given the introduction, and I'm ready to take questions. Kim, over to you.
Yes, my video's just kind of popping up. So if anyone has any questions that they want to throw in the Q&A box that should appear at the bottom of your screen, go ahead and do that. We did have some trouble at the beginning of this with some access that we've kind of restored mid-program. So we hope any of those people who joined us midway, please accept our sincerest apologies. Sometimes Zoom is more complicated than we anticipate, and we did record this program. So we will get that out to you tonight. I'm gonna get it up on our YouTube channel and email it out. So those who had trouble accessing will be able to jump in right away
And I can
watch
probably
that.
try and put the PowerPoint up on my website in the same place that I've never tried to do this. Hopefully, where the article is, I'll try and I'll try to do that in a couple of days, so you can look for it.
Yeah, if in your confirmation emails, we sent you all Eliot's website. So if you heard what he said, he will be putting the PowerPoint slides there. Otherwise, they'll be part of this recording that you'll be able to view later.
I'm also going to update the article. I have a few changes that I need to make. And I'm always updating the website.
So someone asked, what was your most reliable source?
You mean of the legend of Sleeping Bear? I think any of those the ones that we had from the Native community are pretty reliable. So the latest one, I mean, surprising it was still being told by Jowinnacom, around 1950. We know that there were people within the community continued to tell the story. I think that the versions by Wright and by Windigo-ish are, they're good solid versions. I don't think they were heavily redone. But of course, none of this is the same as where we have the collections that were done in native languages by professional linguists working with narrators who wanted to preserve their traditions. That's a whole different kind of reliability. Unfortunately, nobody tried to do that either at Grand Traverse or in Little Traverse. Wright's book, people should get a hold of Wright's book. It's really quite good, although he didn't include the PG rated stories that I'm sure he had heard. But it's really quite good for there. But I mean, the thing is, when people went out and collected in the native language, they went to the most isolated places where you still had the monolingual, mostly storytellers. And by time that was happening, West Michigan, was not a place they wanted to go.
Someone asked, Eliot, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Boston, but we moved here to Michigan in 1980. And the first place that we came broke was Sleeping Bear Dunes. And yes, we climbed down from number 9 at Pierce Stocking Drive and have not done it since.
Someone says, thank you, very interesting. And then have you written any books about this history?
I actually chose not to try and do this in book form. I mean, I've been working on this stuff for 40 years, but I was doing other things, largely teaching and being involved with teacher education, developing cross-cultural curriculum and that kind of thing. And I basically decided that web publishing lets me do things that I can't do if you do it in a book form. I can write infinitely long pieces, and it's up to you whether or not you want to read everything that I've got. I assume most people don't read the whole thing. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm sure I overdo people's indulgence, but not having to write in a way that's restricted to fit the form even of a book publication, let alone an academic article, I find very freeing. And at this point in my life, I don't have to make money from this. I don't have to worry about tenure and any of those kind of things. So I'm putting it out there. I hope people can find it useful. I'm trying different formats. Some I'm trying to do some shorter, just the story part for people. But really, if you want to have a sense of the traditional stories, having the comparison versions across many places is very enlightening. So that's what I'm doing.
Someone says, thank you, you're great. Great information and pictures. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Are these folklore / fakelore books available at the ranger station? That is probably, I'll just probably say, probably you don't have the answer to that, Eliot.
Oh, I'm sure that the picture book, the standard picture book, which has been criticized on the for the same reasons that if you read my fakelore and children's literature article, um, that goes beyond the question of whether or not the legend itself is authentic or old. There are criticisms of the picture book. There are other versions that I've seen there at different times. And I mean, they're available all over the place.
Someone asks, is there a large Native American population remaining in Michigan? And if so, how did they avoid being removed to Indian territories like Oklahoma?
Whew.
And if you're not prepared to answer that one, we can definitely.
No, I mean, I could give a very brief answer, but there's a lot written about it, and there are other people you might get to give a talk on that. Yeah, there's a fairly large, population in different places. I mean, there are a lot of people who are not do not live on the reservations or whatever we want to call them now, or even are affiliated. But we've got the Grand Traverse Band, we've got the Little Traverse Band. There are a number of newer places like Little River. There's the Potawatomi further downstate, and there are a number of tribes or bands up reservations in the UP, including the Sioux and Bay Mills, and out at Lance, many of whom are very active doing important environmental work and so on. How they avoided being removed, some didn't. And the other, I'd say, by the skin of their teeth and very hard work.
Were there any efforts during the WPA era to collect these stories as ethnohistory?
There's the legend of the Seven Avengers is actually from the WPA book on Michigan. But I think there was not a concerted effort at that point to do it. That's a great book. I'm sure it's in my bibliography or a footnote, but I'm not aware. There may be stuff that's in archives that I don't know about. Nobody knows about yet. We keep finding new things. There's archives are wonderful. So keep digging.
I'm going to read two of them because they're related. Are you bilingual, and do you speak Anishinaabe?
I don't think I call myself bilingual, and I do not feel comfortable speaking. What I can do is a very strange thing, except it's not the other folklorists who do it. I can read the old international phonetic alphabet texts quite fluently, and translate with a dictionary. And I feel quite comfortable with that, and I think I can do it quite well. It's a very different kind of translation than somebody who would read this and speak the language fluently and does it sort of automatically into English in their head. I would love to see other people who have that kind of fluency do those kind of translations. All these stories deserve multiple translations, just as we have multiple translations of Tolstoy or other great foreign language literature. And I think they would come out quite differently. But of course, people would then have to familiarize themselves with the IPA approach. I've put a couple stories where I've tried to transfer it to the current um, uh, way of current orthographies that are being used. Um, I very nervous about doing that because you lose so much of how the actual pronunciations were. There's so many dialect variations. But if you look at the one that I did um, for the wampum bear, you'll see what that looks like.
Are there still oral traditions to be captured among these peoples today, or is it too late?
I don't know. I mean, they're what I would call revivalist storytellers. There was oh God, I'm forgetting her name. There was a woman who used to do school programs for me. It's a wonderful storyteller. Um, who's now deceased, unfortunately, from Little Traverse community. Um, so there's that kind of thing happening. But they're professional. I don't know that I would say we would go out and collect them. I'm not sure they're sort of people who are still telling the story within their families and the way they're used to be. I know when I first moved to Michigan, I tried to find some people and decided that I was better off, given my interests, actually going back to these old versions that nobody had really dealt with. It's wonderful um, bilingual collections. And that was more something that I could do well than trying to find people um, who were out there in the community. Although at that point, there were still some people telling stories.
Did you meet Kiwe Dinakwe before she passed?
Did I meet who?
They've said the person who asked the question just referred to her as Key, but I think
Oh,
they
Key.
meant,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Key. Yes, I knew Key slightly. Uh, she was, of course, trained in ethnobotany at University of Michigan. Um, and my wife was actually quite close to her, can't remember, goddaughter or somebody who was very close to her.
Do you have Native blood? And if not, how did you become interested in Native folklore and traditions? And how have you been received in the local Native communities?
No, I'm an old-fashioned folklore scholar. Do not have native blood. I mean, I've always been interested when I started graduate school. Um, I've, uh, always been interested in mythology. Actually, I've been interested in mythology and stories going back to elementary school. That was my interest in graduate school, and when I moved to Michigan, um, that became what my interest is. Um, I mean, I think people in the Native community have mixed feeling about old-fashioned scholars. Um, I think we're very important in helping really go back to what's there. There are things I know as a scholar. I'm familiar with, hundreds of different versions of things. I'm very supportive of old-fashioned scholars who come out of the Native community. I think we need a lot more of them. But I do think that, I mean, there's some hostility towards old-fashioned scholarship, but I think it's much more valuable than whatever people feel the downside is.
Manitou Payment. Is this a name? My grandmother's maiden name is Payment from Leelanau County. Originally came from Grenville and Montreal, Canada in 1861.
No, I think that was a voyage or whatever misnaming of what's actually Manitou Beamois, Manitou shot with an arrow. And it became a name. A lot of these names became corrupted. I mean, even things like Wobbleshanks, which we clearly know where it came from. It means little fox.
Have you worked with the Grand Traverse Band while gathering information?
No, I really have not since we came up. I've had students in the past who were active in the band, but I've basically fallen back to spending my time working with these old texts. I mean, where I think my work is more useful is in some of the in terms of the interests of the band, is in some of the multicultural education stuff, some of which I've put on my website. We really need to. Man, I feel badly when I hear people from the band say, "Oh, it's so much better now than when I was in school because my kid is not being taught how wonderful Custer was." Well, yeah, I mean that's good, but we really could do much more with curriculum. And I will go back to a point I used to make when I was doing a lot of the curriculum. I don't think that using traditional stories is a particularly good way to teach about other cultures in grade school, especially elementary school. I think the way to do it is what we call slice of life stories, both historical and contemporary, where they're really people are telling about their personal experiences. And there really are some wonderful examples of that out there. One of the ones that I don't know whether I'm violating copyright, but I put on the website anyway. There was a woman named Maud Kegg who told native language, basically her personal stories to John Nichols, who's a very good linguist, whose dictionary is the main one I use. And this came out in a book about 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And I excerpted a small portion, just the English version, of the story she told from her grandmother's maple syrup camp, which, to give you an idea how wonderful they are, she starts with, "When I was a little girl, when I was a naughty little girl." So you're talking about somebody probably age 80 talking about remembering when she was a 5-year-old, and it's great stuff. And I would much prefer that kind of stuff as a way for teaching in schools.
What prompted your move to Michigan from Boston?
We actually came from my wife's job, and then I latched on to Michigan State. And we hadn't originally thought we'd settle here. We thought we'd go back to Boston or New England. But after coming up to Sleeping Bear and taking our first trip up to the UP, I decided this was a pretty good place.
As a North Porter, I appreciated your inclusion of Reverend Smith, but even more the Monty Python reference. Sorry I missed the opening, but how do the folklore themes / tone of our local peoples compare or contrast with other Native cultures like Navajo or Pueblo tribes?
Well, I'm gonna say as a bias that the stories in William Jones's collection, which are really from Minnesota, but they're Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. I think it's the finest set of stories that's been collected. I'm biased. All these traditions are wonderful, and there are wonderful collections of stories from Northwest Coast, from Navajo, from Hopi, and other Great Lakes. But the Jones collection is particularly good. I have to say one of my other favorites is from the Nez Perce that Archie Finney collected from his mother. He was a native. William Jones, whose stories, who was the linguist who did the collection that I work most from, was a Meskwaki fox, and that I don't know if it was his first language, but he was fluent in fox, which made it much easier for him than to work in Ojibwe. Which is they're both Algonquin languages.
Many thanks for this interesting and new to me examination of complexities involving Native literature. And then that was the end of, oh wait, nope, there's one more. Are you familiar with a project done by Grand Valley, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, by students who interviewed elders in Michigan Native communities to help preserve their stories and traditions? Their research was put into a small book. It included stories of bear walks, spirit travel, and witchcraft. My mother once had this book. I cannot locate it and have been unable to track it down.
It's referenced in a footnote in my piece. I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, and yes, one of the actually I think there are a couple of things, but one of them might be in the in the paper on the history, but I definitely there was a Baju origin of a place where he sat on his butt that was included in that collection, and if you look through the section on the landscape origin stories, that one's in there, and we'll have that reference. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Mark Smith says, thank you, Eliot.
Oh.
I know you referenced him earlier. And then someone says, glad you are doing this work. And that was the end of the questions in the Q&A, but I'm just going to scroll through the chat. I think there maybe was a couple that were thrown in there. Give me a moment. Wonderful overview of this legend. Now I know how to pronounce some of these names. I think that we got that one. Okay, I think we covered them all. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. Thank you so much to Eliot. And like I said earlier, I will be sending out the recording later this evening or immediately afterwards. It just depends on how long it takes the upload. And then I'll also include in that email a link to Eliot's website. So you all have that, and you can reference those footnotes with all those great books that he's been mentioning. And then Eliot also mentioned that he would put the slides on his website in a few days.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna wait a few days in case people want, because in order to add anything, I have to take the website offline for a while. So I think I'll wait a few days, but if you want to check back, let's say the beginning of next week, I will spend a short time taking the website down and then put it back up with some new things.
And once again, thank you so much to those folks who bore with us through the access issue. We really appreciate your understanding. And then I just want to give a shout out behind the scenes. My coworker, Elizabeth Adams, has been helping troubleshoot things and answer questions in the chat. And then Judy, our Zoom support person, who helped solve our problem while we were live doing this. So thank you to everyone. And thank you so much, Eliot.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Okay, bye.